Well, we're a little more than a week into a Biden administration, and he's already committed treason in half a dozen different ways, at least. Um, and one of these has to do with an executive order on so-called transgender equality. Equality for so-called transgender people, and in particular with a focus on like equal access to restrooms and equal access to sporting teams and sporting facilities and whatnot. Um, and we all know the story here. We've seen it a million times where some mediocre male athlete who's like in the middle of the pack or the bottom of the pack transitions and starts competing as a woman and cleans the floor with them, moves up to the top of the rankings in the women's division. So we all know this story. We all know about the insurmountable biological advantages male athletes have against women, because of their chromosomal and physiological and hormonal differences. And of course, the reaction from conservatives like Matt Walsh has been predictable. Like, oh no, not so-called transgenders in our women's sports. How unfair. Poor women. We've got to protect them. And I use the air quotes and qualify that they're so-called transgenders because, that term encompasses several different real-world phenomena. And so there's a little bit of conflation going on, a little bit of verbal sleight of hand by lumping them all together into one term. And also, they aren't what they say they are. So it's also a bit fraudulent as well. But, this whole outcry over the situation with women's sports really raises the question, do we even need women's sports? I mean, it's questionable how much we need any sports in this day and age. Yeah, they're great, for training teamwork and competitiveness and that kind of stuff. So, they have some value within an educational context, within maybe a collegiate context. But, we've seen pro sports be weaponized and propagandized into the bread and circuses that prop up a corrupt and parasitic regime engaged in hostile and malicious agendas. And they do so oftentimes, through the venue of these pro sports events. And, but just at a more general level, a more fundamental level, what we see are, physically demanding, dangerous activities for the most part. Extremely, physically demanding and physically punishing. High risk of injury in many of these sports, even the non-contact ones, but especially the contact ones. And you have tournament-style competitions where there are a large number of people who would like to rise to the elite level in these sports, but they have to compete pretty aggressively. They have to put their personal development in other areas on hold or at a lower priority in order to develop these athletic capabilities to rise to this elite level. And very few of them ever actually will. So it's tremendously costly and risky. A lot of time and energy is wasted. A lot of injuries and heartbreak result from seeking to win these tournament-style competitions just to get in and be able to compete at the elite level in most of these sports. And for males, it may still make a certain amount of sense because there is a lot of money and status and other tangible and intangible benefits to be won in these sporting events. A lot of people enjoy these sports. They enjoy watching these sports. They'll pay a lot of money to spectate these sports. And so there are a lot of benefits on the line at stake to be competed over. And so all this competition and the risk and the uncertainty and also the risk of injury and all the other things, for a risk-tolerant man, and men are more expendable than women, and that's just biological because the male part in reproduction is biologically less costly, so individual males are more expendable and therefore more risk-tolerant and more specialized for risk-taking activities, of which these athletic activities are an example. It may make a certain amount of sense, but what sense does it make to kind of transpose women into that context where there aren't even the benefits on the line? There's no status in women's sports. There's hardly any money. Almost nobody watches them unless, out of some kind of vaguely prurient interest. They're not watching them for the love of the game or because, the thrill of seeing somebody at the peak of excellence in this particular endeavor competing. Those aren't the reasons people are watching women's sports for the most part. So there are many fewer benefits on the line, maybe more risk in the sense that, women are more likely to get injured, etc. And certainly women have many more valuable things to be doing, feminine roles to be fulfilling that will go wanting if they're focusing on masculine things like sports, competitive things like sports, risky things like sports to which they're not ideally suited and which are not ideally suited to them. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense to have women in sports at all, or to even have women's divisions of most sports. Now, there are great reasons for women to exercise and to participate in things like, dance or gymnastics or yoga or, any number of different kind of fitness-related activities. There's plenty of reasons for that. But in terms of like the competitive sports, it just doesn't seem to suit their psychology, their physiology. The cost-benefit analysis doesn't stack up because women are more risk-averse in general, and also because there are many fewer benefits on the line. Just because, there are fewer people watching and fewer resources available to claim by these means. So it's interesting that one of the biggest white knights for women in sports is Joe Rogan. And he's always going on about, how unfair it is for women to have to compete with these so-called transgenders. But this upright defender of protecting women from unfair competition doesn't favor protecting women in other ways, like from unprincipled man whores. There was an interesting exchange between Rogan and Peterson a while back where Rogan was pressing Peterson to defend his ideas about enforced monogamy, and Rogan was trying to put a bad cast on it, like kind of implying that Peterson was suggesting that the government should forcibly redistribute women to incels or something like that. And he kept saying, they just have to improve themselves. They just have to improve themselves. And Peterson was like, yeah, I know, that's like my whole shtick. But it also has to happen in the context of enforced monogamy because, otherwise really bad things happen. There's this Pareto distribution where, most of the women are going to end up chasing after a small percentage of the guys and not able to secure commitment from them. So they're not going to get what they want. And even though they demonstrate a preference for having access to these guys some of the time over having access to them none of the time, they're going to hit the wall pretty soon, and then they're not even going to be able to get that, and they're going to be frustrated and unfulfilled, and all these other guys are going to be shit out of luck, and nobody's going to be happy except for maybe these tiny number of guys. Rogan was just making all these like libertarian individualist counter arguments. Well, that's what people choose, and yeah, it is what people choose, but unfortunately, individual choices don't always lead to collectively optimal outcomes. It's just like the prisoner's dilemma, right? So everybody making the individually rational choices isn't going to lead to a collectively rational outcome. And if people's choices are limited in some ways, you can lead to outcomes that are individually better for most of those individuals. And, ultimately, and this was a point that Peterson made in that exchange, it is all about the children. So what we're trying to do, what we should be trying to do, what every civilization that actually exists for any period of time does try to do, is maximize the occurrence of children existing in stable homes with both of their biological parents. And that's the desired outcome there, because that's the optimal outcome for the children, for the next generation. And if individual choices aren't leading to that happening, then the civilization will suffer generation over generation. And we need to get back to a state of affairs where it is propagating from one generation to another, and in a pro-social way and a non-pathological way. But anyway, that's a huge aside. My point with all this is just that this fundamental male impulse to white knight, to protect women, it's great in many circumstances, but for it to be worthwhile, what the women are doing has to be worthwhile. So there can't be this unconditional tendency or impulse to white knight. Women have to be doing something worthwhile, which typically will mean something traditionally feminine, fulfilling the roles and responsibilities to which they alone are best suited, and which are best suited to them, that we can't fulfill. And then it's worthwhile to protect them. Then it's worthwhile to white knight for them. It can't be unconditional, because it's not worthwhile to white knight for women and protect women in cases where they're being, pig-headed or whorish, or where they're allowing themselves to be taken advantage of by unprincipled man whores, or any of these other things entitled foolish things that they do. So use a little bit of discretion. It's great that males want to protect females. That's a natural impulse that we have. It's worthwhile when women are doing worthwhile things, but it has to have that conditional. It can't be unconditional. It can't be open-ended. So don't just go around white knighting for women in every circumstance, like women in sports where, there's a real question, do we even need women's sports? Or any of these other contexts. Use a little discretion, use a little bit of common sense when deciding when to white knight and who to white knight for and under what conditions to white knight.